Good afternoon, colleagues. My presentation is an overview of the RISDP 2020-2030 costing, and it builds up on the presentation that has just been provided by my colleague, Dennis Ruemamu from the SADC Secretariat, who took you through a presentation of the SADC Vision 2030 and also the RISDP 2020-2030. So I'm building up on that and providing a sense of the costing of that strategy. So I'll give very, very briefly the background to the costing, and I'll also touch on the process of the costing, and I'll also give you an understanding of the key assumptions that have been used during the costing, and I'll also then finally touch on very, very briefly the costs of the regional coordination activities, the national coordination costs, and also the regional investment costs. I must point out that at this point in time, only the regional coordination costs is what has been finalized. The national coordination costs and the investment costs are still being worked on and finalized. So the background to the costing of the RISDP 2020-2030 is that it obviously builds on the RISDP results chain, which has already been provided during the presentation by Dennis, where he took you through the architecture of the RISDP itself, and I won't go through that. But just to say that in August 2020, the summit approved the strategy, and Council then directed the Secretariat to develop a costed implementation plan. Then the Secretariat went ahead to develop the implementation plan, which would inform the costing exercise. So the implementation plan, it links the outcomes, outputs to key interventions that are in the RISDP. And also it looks at the sector strategies and the plans and indicates who is responsible for delivering on the outputs. Member states were then requested to provide inputs into the implementation matrix, which was then eventually finalized and has been approved. So we have a RISDP implementation plan on the basis of which the costing of the RISDP has now been undertaken. So the costing of the RISDP was done in three phases. First, there was the element of costing the regional coordination activities, which was driven to a large extent by the SADC Directorate, PPRM, who were in the lead, and other directorates and units in the SADC Secretariat were involved in this exercise. Then the other element was the costing of interventions that are being implemented at a national level. So those interventions being implemented at a national level were being informed by what was being implemented at the regional level, or what is going to be implemented at the regional level. And to do this, national costing teams were put in place in the member states, and also there was a team of consultants, which I was involved with, who assisted in coming up with the national coordination costs. And then the third pillar is the costing of investment projects. And this exercise was led by a special task team in the Directorate of PPRM, and also they've been working closely with the other directorates and also with the member states in coming up with the investment costs. The detailed methodology involved coming up with a template for the regional coordination activities, which was aligned to the internal costing and reporting templates used by the SADC directorates and units. It's not the first time that SADC is undertaking an exercise of this nature. So the exercise built upon the previous experience that the Secretariat had engaged in. And once the regional coordination costs were finalized, then this was now used as a basis of also now working on the national coordination course, which also had its templates that were utilized to gather the information, the data that was required. And also lastly, the regional investment costs, which I alluded to, were also undertaken. The costing exercise was also undertaken on the basis of templates that were put together to inform the costing of this coordination, these activities. The details that were captured in these templates, to start with, looked at the outcomes, also looked at the outputs, the targeted outputs, and also looked at the key performance indicators. And also we had the output implementation period, which was running right up to 2030, and also considered other SADC sector strategies with funding allocated to the main activities. This information was then passed on to the member states, who also were then able to indicate what were the activities that were undertaking in terms of the core activities and what were the sub-activities, and then come up with the cost estimates for each of these activities. There were a number of key assumptions that were used to do the costing. First of all, the cost estimates were based on US dollar values. And also it was assumed that these were aligned to the regional coordination activities. And also a weighted factor was used to average out unit costs, where we had a number of activities that were being undertaken, where, for example, you had consultants coming up under different classes. At the end of the day, it was agreed that we'd have one average cost that would be used, not to break down according to the level of expertise of the consultants. In the case of workshops, it was also assumed that these events would largely be physical events and that we would not have virtual engagements. This is obviously a worst case scenario in terms of costing. If we do have hybrid events or events that are virtual, it will then mean that these would cost less. It was also assumed that most of the activities will be undertaken at the member state level, and that the SADC Secretariat will be responsible for organizing and hosting regional events, and also that we would have short-term actions that fall within the broader sets of activities, such as facilitation, coordination, monitoring, reporting, resource mobilization, TA, advocacy, outreach, capacity building, development of tools and guidelines. I mean, these were broadly most of the activities when it came to regional coordination, as well as when it came to national coordination activities. The annual cost estimates were also adjusted to factor the realities in the member states' economies, i.e., if we're assuming that there'll be growth of the national economies, again, this was also used to factor the way the costs were arrived at. In terms of investment projects, the investment costs were based on the key regional and sectoral plans. And the selection of the regional projects was informed by these frameworks and reports, and I won't go through all of them. And I'm sure my colleague from the AFDB will also touch on some of the major infrastructure projects that are planned during this particular period. The subsectors for regional investments were based on a number of sectors or subsectors in the pillars: defense, agriculture, capital markets, transport, energy, water, etc., which were then looked at as the basis of the costings. The criteria for selecting the projects was based on the fact that the projects have been advanced and their commitments from member states, or that they are preparations that will be undertaken between 2020 up to 2030, i.e. there was some serious commitment on these projects, and that these projects would be implemented during this period. But of course, understanding that in some cases there will be a lot of planning that will be undertaken as part of the costings for these projects. The cost estimates and the year of completion is based on the reporting frameworks and submissions that were coming in from the member states. And again, it was also assumed that these regional projects are aligned to national priorities and also the identified sector corridors. Now, let me then just very briefly touch on the costing of the various elements. To start with, the total RISDP 2020-2030 regional coordination costs, excluding staff costs, we are looking at a figure of $413,463,280 US dollars. And the breakdown, according to the costs, is that 20% will go to the foundation pillar, peace, security, and good governance. And then the first pillar on industrial development and market integration will be about 33%. And also then we have the pillar on infrastructure taking 15% of the costs, and the third pillar on social and human capital taking 15.820228 million, 4% of the costs. And then the cross-cutting issues taking 25%. And lastly, the strategic management of the RISDP taking a 4% of the total cost. So this is how these regional costs have been arrived at for coordinating the implementation of the RISDP. In terms of the national coordination costs, again, as I've indicated, these are still work in progress, not yet finalized. We're talking a figure of 17 billion, which I think you all agree is quite high. And I'm sure that figure is going to be refined a little further once it's finalized, the costing which is being done by the member states. So 3% is allocated to the peace, security, and good governance pillar, and 8% goes to the pillar number 1 on the IDT, industrial development and market integration. Then pillar 2 infrastructure takes 56%, and 22% pillar 3, and then 11% on cross-cutting issues, and 0.2% on strategic management of the RISDP. I am sure there are costs that have been allocated under pillar 2 infrastructure, which will probably move across to the regional investment costs, and as such would then see a significant reduction of the projected national coordination costs. But this is still work in progress. And then the last area of costing is on the regional investment costs, and the total projected cost is 57 billion US dollars, and you can see it's quite a significant figure given the very nature of these activities or projects that will be implemented, with a bulk allocated to the second pillar, infrastructure, and then followed by the first pillar on industrial development and market integration, and then We have the cross-cutting issues, and then the third pillar on social human capital development. Colleagues, this in brief is the presentation that I thought I could share with you on the costing of the RISDP. As I've indicated, the regional coordination costs, those have been finalized. What is still outstanding are the national coordination costs and also the regional investment costs. The importance of this exercise is clearly that member states are able to articulate what it costs for them to implement the undertaking that they have made to implement the RISDP. And within these costs that have been put together, there are activities that have been earmarked, activities out of which then member states are then able to indicate the costs that are associated with implementation of these activities. It therefore then provides a basis of approaching funders, potential funders, who can then partner with member states to fund these activities. And I think the way this exercise has been undertaken provides a good basis for member states and partners to understand the costs associated with implementation of the RISDP, and therefore form a basis of engagement, a basis of developing projects that then get costed. And I'm sure this workshop that you have, this meeting that you have, will also then provide a good understanding of how the region can approach resource mobilization based on a good appreciation of what it is that is going to be implemented and the associated costs. I hope my presentation will be able to give you that appreciation and form also a foundation of carrying through the activities of building the capacities of resource mobilization to be able to fund successfully our implementation of the RISDP 2020-2030. I thank you.